and we're going to show you a new interactive map that brings together the completed research. It's going to show you where the extent to which nitrogen exceeds current regulations in New Zealand catchments and the likely impact of applying all known on-farm mitigations. You can see down the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. So you're welcome to submit questions. We're going to hold all the questions until the end of the webinar, and we've allowed heaps of time for questions. There's about 30 minutes at the end of the webinar for questions, so do feel free to ask anything you like. By attending the webinar, we will add you to the recipient news for our e-newsletter, and that comes out about 6 times a year, and there's an unsubscribe link in the newsletter, so you can get rid of it if you don't want it anymore. I am going to tell you who's speaking today, and then we will get straight into the research. So first up, Ton Snelder, the Director of Land, Water, People and member of the Land Use Suitability and Land Use Opportunities Program team, developed a pressure indicator that's the basis for the work he's going to present today. He's going to explain what the nitrogen excess side of the interactive map tells us. Then Richard McDowell, the Chief Scientist of our Land and Water, who did the research that he's going to present today alongside members of the Sources and Flows research program, will explain what the achievable reduction side of the interactive map tells us about the effect of adopting all known on-farm mitigations and if it will ease the pressure by 2035. He's also going to share with us how much better today's water quality is compared to a scenario where no action was taken while the same intensification occurred. Then Roger Young, who is the Group Manager for Freshwater Sciences at the Cawthron Institute and Project Lead of the Register of Land Management Actions, will tell us what we can do with this information. His program is working to compile on-farm actions to mitigate the loss of contaminants and make the information accessible, which is going to give people all over New Zealand greater awareness of the efforts underway to improve our fresh water. So, first of all, we'll hear from Ton.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Sorry about that. So I'm going to talk quickly about how we have calculated and mapped catchment pressure. So we started with data that's been collected at about 680 monitoring sites throughout New Zealand. These were sites that have at least 10 years of monthly concentrations of nitrogen, and they cover a wide range of catchment conditions. So by that I mean a wide range of climate, topography, geology, and also a wide range of catchment land use. These data that were derived from these monitoring sites are then used as input into catchment models that are used to predict concentrations and loads at unmonitored locations. So effectively we can predict fairly accurately concentrations and loads for all locations across New Zealand using these models. So this is what maps of those predicted concentrations and loads look like. So on the left-hand side, these are concentrations of total nitrogen, and on the right-hand side, these are loads expressed as loads per unit catchment area per year, so kilograms per hectare per year. So these two patterns obviously look fairly similar because concentrations and loads are very strongly related to one another. And what we see is high concentrations and loads in areas that are subject to intensive land use, such as the Waikato, Taranaki, Manawatu, Canterbury, Southland, and patchy bits across the country really. And low concentrations in areas that are high, steep and cold, obviously often in the Docker state. So what we then do is we take those concentrations and loads and we compare them to criteria that will achieve acceptable conditions in the downstream receiving environments. So those are lakes, rivers and estuaries. By acceptable here, we're talking about the National Objective Framework bottom lines for rivers and lakes and an equivalent state for estuaries. And so what we do is we compare the criteria for these receiving environments with the predicted concentrations and loads, and where the predicted concentrations and loads are less than the criteria, we classify the environment as being in an acceptable condition. And where the concentrations and loads exceed the criteria, we obviously have an excess of nitrogen, and that nitrogen excess can be expressed on a scale from relatively low to very high. The next step is that catchments upstream of those receiving environments that have an excess of nitrogen are described as being under pressure. So a map of those catchments that are upstream of receiving environments that have got an excess of nitrogen is the final output of this process. And the catchments are coloured according to the degree of pressure. So obviously the brighter the red, the higher the pressure. And what you can interpret that as meaning is the greater the reduction required to bring that receiving environment into an acceptable condition. And so now I can pass to my colleague here.
Thanks, Tom. Okay, so there are a couple of pertinent questions that relate to the pressure map that Tom's just been espousing. First one is to recognise that there's been an awful lot of work that's gone on in the last 20 years in terms of actions to improve water quality. So we're asking the question here, what's been achieved over the last 20 years? And we make the assumption that we would be using the practices of 20 years ago and do the modelling now being 2015 in this particular exercise. And then the next question is, well, how low can we go in, say, another 15 or 20 years? And that's if you assume that we implement 100% all the mitigation actions that we have nationwide. Just to reiterate a point here, what we've been looking at in this particular, analysis is not only the loss of nitrogen, phosphorus and sediment, but under different permutations of climate, soil type, topography. But it's the management that really dictates that you can have a nitrogen loss that can be higher, for example, under deer that could be under dairy. Could be quite rare occurrence, but the point is that management often overwhelms many of these other attributes or biophysical components. And what we've done is, obviously we don't have access to everyone's data, nor should we, they're private. But what we can do is we can come up with typologies, and typology could represent different combinations of soil type, light, heavy soils, different slopes, relatively flat or relatively steep, different climates, and management factors such as inputs, be they as fertilizer or feed, stock management. And we've gone about this for two date stamps, one in 2015 and one in 1995. These typologies, when you map them out across the country, they cover most of dairy and sheep and beef land. In fact, some of the dry stock area happens to encompass some of the cropping land as well. And what we've done with each of those typologies, so once you estimate the loss of, say, nitrogen and phosphorus, you can also estimate the effect of an action, so a mitigation action, some of those which the next presenter will talk about, for example. But you can layer them on top of one another in an order, taking practicalities into account, the suitability of a particular action for a system, and then also potentially the cost effectiveness. And if we were to do that, for example, what we've got here is the quantity of nitrogen that's mitigated by a number of different practices. Practices that we've modelled in both 1995 and 2015. Things such as stock exclusion or stream fencing, as it's called here, better effluent practice, also better irrigation practice, so not either apply water or effluent onto wet soils. When you extrapolate that out over what were many typologies, we can come up with a national estimate. And if we're using the practices of 20 years ago, our nitrogen and phosphorus losses would be around 45 and 98% greater than they are now. But of course, land area has changed, as has the intensity of farming, and those mitigation practices haven't necessarily kept up, which mean that, for example, in nitrogen, it's increased by around 20%. But those change in land uses have also meant that there's been around a 30% decrease due to in sediment losses due to afforestation, some of those stock exclusion practices, and also the soil conservation works that have been undertaken. But what could be achieved in the next 20 years? Well, we took those established measures, so those are things like exclusion, better effluent or irrigation practice, better optimum wholesome P or fertiliser applications, and then we layered on some of the, I guess, more developing mitigation strategies. For example, the retention dams that are being tested in the Bay of Plenty area, which allow floodwaters to sediment out, not only the sediment but also the P. Grazing in areas where you have slopes such that the areas next to the stream are left last and left uncovered, therefore reducing the amount of sediment loss. Or adding either sorbents to the soil or the stream itself, all the way through to something such as controlled drainage, which holds water in the soil for longer, allowing nitrogen to denitrify and be lost, and also for sediment and phosphorus to be settled out and therefore not enter the stream. So here's what I guess we can achieve, I guess, between 2050 and 2035. On average, across all those typologies, there's around a third of the nitrogen that can be reduced. Some areas, such as the Waikato, potentially even in Canterbury here where we are, you can make greater reductions. The range is around 10 to 70%, depending upon where you are in the country and the topology and farm system that you operate. Similar sort of scenario for phosphorus, a little bit more, 36 instead of 34%. But again, you've got hotspots, which I always say hotspots of reductions in which you can achieve your losses. Now, what we've done here at this particular stage is that we've worked these mitigations up into a map. So here you show, well, here we're showing Tom's map of pressure. It's nationwide. I've just chosen the Waikato because I've only been in Canterbury for 3 years, so I'm not one-eyed yet. But anyway, if you swipe to the right, you can see the pressure, catchment by catchment. If you swipe to the right, you can see that what can be done about it, assuming full implementation of mitigation strategies. You can even click on a particular catchment. And from this example, we've got the Piako River, which has an excess of around 11 kilos of total N per hectare, and then a potential to reduce total loads, so not just the excess, but what also is being emitted beneath the excess, of around 21 to 22%. The site, the address I should say, for this particular application will be on our Landfill website after this, along with a whole bunch of other resources. Now, I just wanted to give one example of how this could be applied. And we've done this nationally. So the question that often crops up, is this enough? So these are old numbers that relate to old thresholds that proposed and are not policy, it should be noted. Especially for the DRP, or dissolved reactive phosphorus. When we convert those, I guess, percentage reductions and look at the current thresholds, you come up with a map that looks like this. Obviously, red areas are areas where they are still in excess of proposed, well, what were proposed DIN thresholds. The important point here is that it is 4% of all agricultural area. And we haven't taken into account things such as land use change, or indeed the ability for new mitigations to come along line. And so it's likely that that may decrease. Two important points are, though, that one, this is done on a per farm basis. And if you're looking at this and you're sitting in a red area, what can be done? Well, there are some options out there, and you look at the next two webinars, we'll give you a few of those. And then secondly, it's all about a collective effort. So it's not just you who are in the particular catchment, there are other people within the catchment, and it's important to learn from those people and to learn how they could and should be done, those mitigations. And so that's where I'll end, and I'll hand over to Roger to talk a bit more about that.
So yeah, I'm talking about a 3-year project that we're about a year into looking at, trying to understand what actions people are doing out there in the community and acknowledging other members of the team that are involved in this project. So we know we've got some challenges, as Tom has pointed out. Some of the waterways throughout New Zealand are in poor condition and some are going backwards. But we know there's widespread recognition of this issue, and we know that a lot of people are doing things to reverse this trend. So, but the problem is that we don't know what is being done, how much is being done, and where it's done. So this register is focusing on that. This lack of knowledge means we've got limited ability to determine the effectiveness of these investments, and then if with that lack of certainty about that, if we can increase that certainty about how effective things are, then we can encourage change to occur more quickly. So we see the solution as development of a register of land management actions, so we know who's doing what, where, and how much to improve the ecosystem health of our waterways. We want to develop a standardised set of indicators of action that we can use across different sectors at a catchment scale. And we're planning to report this information on Lawa Landia Water Aotearoa, so it'll be there alongside catchment scale information on water quality and those sort of things. So that will enable people to zoom out at a national level or a regional level, or zoom right into a catchment or site level and see how their local area is going, what sort of actions are going on in their local catchment, and see if it's making a difference to water quality. So the benefits of this work as we see it, it's really about speeding up action on the ground, better kaitiakitanga of our environmental resources, further demonstration of the benefits of these actions, which will encourage more actions and more effort on the ones that are particularly effective. We also see a real need to get more awareness of efforts underway, so there's a lot of things going on out there. But the general public is perhaps unaware of the degree of effort that is going on across the country to improve things. Another really important thing is Rich has pointed out that if all sites are, mitigation is applied everywhere, what the likely benefits could be, but we don't have a good idea, well, how far along that track are we? Are we 10% of the way there, or are we 90% of the way there? And I'm sure it varies from catchment to catchment, but the register will help enable that assessment to see where we're sitting. And then also we've got at the moment quite a lot of government investment on things like jobs for nature and those sort of things. So there's, if we know where actions are currently within a catchment, the register will enable better planning and see where the gaps are and strategies around, for instance, starting at the headwaters and moving downstream on some of those mitigation actions. So yeah, just making it clear that what we're talking about here is a catchment scale actions and catchment scale responses. There's quite a lot of work that various people have done looking at paddock scale efforts and farm scale efforts, but we're really interested to know at a catchment scale. And when you're thinking at a catchment, it's quite a complex system. You're going to have different land covers and land uses in that catchment. It might be native forest dock estate in the headwaters. You might have sheep and beef on the rolling hill country with maybe some sediment issues, whereas down on the flats there might be dairy farming or horticulture with issues around phosphorus and nitrogen. And you might have a water quality monitoring site down the lower part of the catchment. So really it's a collective effort by everybody in the catchment to mitigate the effects of land management and improve the state of our freshwater systems. So our Land and Water Challenge, like most of the national science challenges, Te Ao Māori is at the heart of the challenge, and so just noting out to our Te Ao Māori leaders in the project, Anika and Sylvia, and so two of our areas we're focusing in are particularly Māori led, one in the South Island, one in the North Island, and we're working with iwi groups throughout the country, from a Māori agribusiness side of things, but also from a kaitiaki side of things, to make sure that we're having impact. So we see a wide range of users of the register, from landowners and managers through to the people that might advise them, and then right through to industry collectives, and then community groups, local government, and also central government. So some of the research questions that we're focusing on is really, it's about what are people wanting from a register like this? What are the questions they might ask if they have this sort of information, and then how can we design the register to meet those needs? We're looking at the range of indicators that could be used to record this information. We have a range of data collected by different people at different scales, so overcoming some of the issues with that is important, and then making sure that the information is used and shared to get the best benefit. So over the last few months, we've been interviewing a wide range of potential users of the register, from farmers, industry groups, iwi, local and central government, to understand features of the register. And so, yeah, the things that have come out from those interviews have been the real need for national consistency, bringing a trusted source of the truth. So an information supplied by one sector may not be trusted to the same extent, so it's a real opportunity for our Land and Water National Science Challenge to be that central trusted source of the truth. Real opportunity to bring together coordinated data across the sectors. So again, it's not just one sector telling their story. It's going to be really important to keep things up to date. The power of storytelling has been something that's been promoted by quite a lot of the people we've talked to. So it's not going to be just the data and numbers coming out of this, it's those stories that are going to be the powerful things that people will latch onto and potentially change or emphasise some of the practices going on. Various other bits and pieces that we'll need to think about in our design. Again, some infographics, maps, photos, things that people can engage with and learn from. Other things that we've learnt from the interviews is really about what we need to be avoiding, and a key thing there is that the register is not a tool for compliance, so it's not something people are going to be very unwilling to share information if that information might come back to bite them. So the register will be designed to make sure that all the reporting is at a sub-catchment scale, and we won't be reporting information at an individual property scale. So individuals won't be singled out, and avoiding that compliance issue. We also have to be careful about comparing of industries. We're talking about catchment scale information here, so not comparing sheep and beef with dairy or forestry and so on. And a real challenge for us is going to be this tension between having enough detail in the information to be useful versus too much detail to be overwhelming and making gathering the information and reporting it too onerous. So those, just to give you an idea of the likely some key indicators that will be used, be things like we'll be getting information into the register, things like the length of stream bank where stock have been excluded or riparian areas have been planted, areas of wetlands protected, areas of erosion control and so on, right through to sort of more broad indicators like the where farm plans are active, or when you're looking across multiple sectors where there's different levels of mitigation. So a challenge again for us there is gold level mitigations in the dairy industry. Are they equivalent to gold level mitigations in the horticulture sector? That'll be probably up to we'll have to work with the sectors there to work on what those levels might be, and they may not be exactly comparable, but if sector defined levels will be very useful. But yeah, in terms of the register reporting coming out of this will be that catchment scale context. So it'll be bringing that individual lengths, for example, into, or how much length of upstream length is stock excluded from, or how much of the existing wetland area upstream is being protected. So we're planning to link the information with individual river reach identifications. So every single river in the country will have spatial information about what's going on upstream. So we intend to report this information through LAWA, as I mentioned earlier, Land, Air, Water, Aotearoa. And for those of you that are familiar with LAWA, it provides a lot of environmental information on waterways, air quality, coastal beach bathing and so on. And so this information on what's being done where will be alongside other environmental information. So yeah, we're about a year into a 3-year project. Some next steps are we've done some scientific literature reviews on indicators, but we've got a kaupapa Māori literature review underway, getting the version 1 of the register built, and then looking at data sharing mechanisms and working with stakeholders that have data on actions, getting more feedback, working with stakeholders on the initial versions of the register and getting that LAWA module built. So.
Thanks, Roger. Thanks, Ton and Rich too. That was great. We're getting heaps of questions in, so we can just tear straight into them. I thought the question that was probably shared by a lot of people was about, it came in from Moritz Lemon about uncertainty. So maybe, Ton, do you want to tackle that one? What is the uncertainty of the estimates of potential, oh, actually, no, maybe this is for you, Rich, the estimates of potential % reduction in excess nitrogen and phosphorus?
Well, I think it's for both of us. So maybe you want to start.
Yeah, so from my side, there's uncertainty around our estimate of the pressure. Because of the nature of these sorts of analyses, the uncertainty is greatest at the site scale, if you like, or the scale of the individual receiving environments. And as we pull away from that and start looking at catchments and then regions, the uncertainty to some extent decreases. But the uncertainties are quite large. Obviously, we're using models here and we're fitting those to relatively sparse data. And so there's quite a lot of uncertainty. If people want to understand that uncertainty in a quantitative way, it's explained in the accompanying article. So in broad terms, we're more confident of the findings at catchment, then regional, then national scale than we are at fine spatial scales. I'll leave it there.
So likewise, there's considerable uncertainty with regards to the % reductions. The level of confidence probably is greater for those that are established in terms of their action, because we have known mitigation responses by observed data to model against. We also have some observed data for some of the developing mitigations, but because they're not, I guess, mechanistic, in terms of their understanding and indeed their modelling, we've had to use ranges. But all this uncertainty pales in comparison to that which would be likely around the implementation. So we've assumed obviously 100% implementation of those actions, and we recognise that that's unlikely to be the case, and hence we're probably overestimating, if anything.
Thanks. A question for you, Ton, from Craig Dupree. At the national scale, which receiving environments are driving the nitrogen reductions? Was it rivers, lakes, or estuaries?
Yeah, so that's a good question. There are, it's a combination of those different types of receiving environments. In some catchments, it's the estuary that is the limiting environment, and in others, it's a lake, and in others, again, it's the river objectives, which are around periphyton. The limitation was dominated by periphyton across the whole country, so that seemed to set the scene. But one point I would make is that if you absented periphyton, we still find fairly high pressure associated with lakes and downstream estuarine receiving environments. So there's quite a high level of coincidence in the pressure or the nitrogen excess across the different types of receiving environments, which gives us some confidence that these numbers are fairly robust to the individual criteria that we're using, whether they be the river, estuary or lake criteria.
And there's another one from Craig there along similar lines. What would the national map of overallocation look like if a 30% exceedance criteria was used?
Yes, so this is quite a complicated issue. Really what Craig's referring to here is some details around the way these criteria are set up. The criteria are actually designed to have a risk-based criteria. So when we talk about a 20% spatial exceedance, we're really talking about a 20% risk that any individual site will fail to achieve the periphyton outcome that's desired, even though we're achieving the nitrogen criteria. If we relax that risk to 30%, then the pressure goes down, obviously, because we are going to have a higher nitrogen concentration as the criteria. So essentially, the easy answer to what Craig's asking is that we would see a reduction in pressure across the country, and therefore a reduction in the nitrogen excess. And it might be by quite a lot, because these relationships are sort of logarithmic, so it's not a linear reduction. It'll be quite non-linear. So I'll leave it there.
Thanks. A couple of questions here for you, Rich. So your research looked at nitrogen, phosphorus and sediment. Question from Elaine Moriarty: why did you exclude E. coli? Was it the lack of reliable models?
Well, we didn't exclude E. coli. However, Elaine is right. There is both a paucity of data and also a paucity of good models with which to do these analyses. So what we did do was describe how those mitigations could reduce fecal contamination, and that's found as in a narrative form, I should say, in the paper.
Thanks. And another question about the mitigations. How did the assessment account for the spatial variability of potential natural attenuation of contaminants across landscapes?
We'll both answer that. I guess in terms of mitigation potential, they were, should I say, optimized in quotation marks towards a particular combination of soil by climate by slope. So they are emissions from at the farm scale in those combinations together with management factors. They're then aggregated up towards a very small reach level, and that's where I'll hand over to Tom with regards to the attenuation element.
Right, so in the predictions of concentrations and loads of nitrogen, attenuation that occurs within the catchment is implicit in those models. And that is because the models are based on the observed in-stream concentrations and loads. And those are the loads that we see after the attenuation has occurred, and which are functions of catchment characteristics that are all represented in the model. So those predictions implicitly incorporate attenuation. I hope that makes sense to people.
There's a related question here I see from Trevor, who's asking with regards to monitoring, would that need to be done on all farming catchments? And if this is ideal, how would it be paid for and implemented? Well, the short answer to that is that, short answer, and then he goes on a long tirade here. So the government is expecting, shall we say, some measurable response within a 5-year time frame. Now that could be true, but it's only true where it is detectable, i.e. the signature decreases the further away it is from the source where you do the action. So we have some sites already where the sites might detect an action that's done close by, but others that may not. And by sites, I mean the regional council or done by research providers. There would have to be some change with regards to, for freshwater management units or catchments, where those sites would have to go to another location. But there's also, I guess, the possibility of citizen science, users even particularly contributing their own data, as long as it's quality assured. And then there's also not the big question, but there's the big catch-all around freshwater farm plans, which looks at both formulating a plan to account for where and when you put in an action, and then auditing those plans such that you're able to use that to inform the process and likelihood of you detecting change. That was a short one.
We're getting some pretty technical questions and some that are specific to particular parts of New Zealand. So I might just hold those to the end if you've asked one of those questions and are waiting for it to be answered and wondering why we're not getting to it. I'll just kind of try and tackle the broader queries first. Roger, will reporting of register data be linked to upstream of existing water quality ecological monitoring sites? And what about unmonitored catchments?
Yes, we're trying to report information from everywhere essentially to understand who's doing what where, and some of those, there's some monitoring sites around the country. There's about 1,200 sites run by regional councils and others on water quality. Obviously some areas are not monitored, and where there isn't monitoring information, then yeah, as Rich said, there's opportunities for citizen science or some of the models that Tom talked about to fill in some of those gaps in terms of likely water quality based on land cover and those sorts of things. So yeah, yep. And coming back to that catchment, the reporting will need to be given that catchment context. So whatever's upstream, obviously what runs off the land and comes down into the catchments, flows down the rivers, it's all of the upstream activities that are collectively influence water quality at a particular site.
There's a question from Simon Love asking, will there be any connection between freshwater farm plans and the new register? That's for you, Roger.
Yeah, definitely, yeah. So as this project has gone on, we've been talking to various agencies that may have information to go in the register. So the dairy industry is one sector that collects this sort of information, and we're hopefully be getting that into the register. The regional council sector is another that has various mechanisms for accessing farm environmental plan information. With the recent change to the RMA, we've got compulsory for freshwater farm plans coming in. Exactly the form of them will play out a bit, but I'm hoping that information in those sort of plans will feed through to councils, and then that sort of information will be available to go into a register like this.
Great. Rich, this is a question for you from Miranda Hunter. Did you look at the impact of mitigations on greenhouse gases?
Not in this particular study, but that has been done before. So there are both co-benefits and, I should say, antagonistic effects associated with many of the mitigations with regards to not only some of those analytes, such as nitrogen, sediment, coli, and phosphorus, but also with GHG emissions. It's important, therefore, and this relates to another question that I see further up from Troy Baisden, in terms of developing and also utilising a good process to put mitigations in place. So it's important that you think about not only the suitability and the practicality, but also those co-benefits or antagonistic effects before you then look at things such as putting them in the right place at the right time, such as critical source area theory, in order to raise any red flags around, I guess, any adverse effects.
Great. Troy also asked about whether there is a process to target and develop new mitigations.
Yeah, well, and I guess from first principles there is, in terms of both quantifying leakage points, not only from the land, but also effects once in stream. So that depends upon the sensitivity of the receiving environment as well. Then it's also down to having a good understanding of the farm system Specifically, we have quite unique systems here in Aotearoa that we can't, I guess, borrow things from other countries, other jurisdictions, and therefore, it's necessary that we spend quite a bit of effort quantifying where those contaminants come from in terms of flow paths and also the timing of those losses in order to target the right mitigation strategy.
There's a question for you, Ton and Rich, from Elizabeth McGrady. If periphyton was the main driver, what were your assumptions relationships to nutrients?
Yes, so essentially the pressure analysis was based on criteria that have been derived to achieve in-stream periphyton biomass objectives, and fundamentally that model represents a relationship that says that we have more periphyton as the concentrations of nitrogen and phosphorus increase. And I think that's about the simplest possible way of answering Liz's question there, I think.
Great. Next question from Kepa Morgan, talking about confidence intervals for monitoring. How constant are the contaminant loads from month to month? Are these considered constant enough not to miss significant variations due to weather events and cyclic influences?
Kia ora, Kepa. Tough question, but never mind. Let's have a go from the land side of it. Here, it's not. No, monthly sampling is likely to miss many of the, shall we say, flashier events, but also errors, that unforeseen errors that might occur on a property. So what's the better monitoring regime? It depends on your farm system again. It depends on quantifying where those flow paths are active and how you can intercept and measure them. It also puts good onus or a stronger emphasis, shall we say, on those freshwater farm plans, or what they will be, ensuring that they are both measurable, spatial, time-bound, and therefore auditable, to ensure that what you said you were doing, you are doing. Then there's the element of detecting that, which we've both done a bit of work in, but I'll let Tom explain.
Okay, yes, I think this is a really good question that gets very complicated very quickly, so I'm going to try and keep it high level. I think there's two things I'd like to say. One is, first of all, when we set an objective for an outcome such as a trophic state outcome, so these pressure maps are fundamentally based on what we call a trophic state outcome: how much periphyton there is in rivers, how much phytoplankton there is in lakes, how much macroalgae there might be in an estuary. Those are the objectives that we're trying to achieve. And our models are really quite simplistic around the relationship of those outcomes to concentrations. And generally speaking, we're thinking about concentrations at the annual time scale. So what median concentration, for example, in a river will make sure that that river doesn't exceed a certain periphyton biomass. That's a very simplified representation of what's really happening in the growth and the cycle of periphyton growing in a river. But that's the level of detail with which we can really work on these problems at this time. So that's the first thing. So our representation of what's needed in terms of a concentration versus what we're trying to achieve is really quite simplistic, and doesn't take into account all of the complicated things that happen at smaller timescales. The other point I'd make is that, and this goes to the other question that Kepa's asking here, is that yes, climate does influence water quality at various timescales, and some of those timescales are quite long. So we're all very aware of El Nino, La Nina. That influences water quality at quite long timescales of up to a decade. And all of these processes are influencing what happens in the landscape. And this is all part of the uncertainty that we've talked about earlier around achieving these outcomes and exactly what we need to do on the land in order to achieve these outcomes in the environment. And it's one of the reasons why there will always be some uncertainty around exactly what we need to do to achieve exactly the outcome we want.
But it's also safe to say that we're getting a better handle on what that uncertainty is and where it is important. So it's, shall we say, not all lost.
Great. There's a question close to the top there from Paul Hughes about whether the irrigation extraction of water has been considered. The question is, how do these approaches consider irrigation extraction of water from rivers and groundwater that indirectly affects river flow lows?
Simple answer is no, they haven't, Paul. Yeah, that's really complicated to work into these models, especially at a national scale. So yeah, we haven't had neither time or resource to do that.
And another technical query from Elizabeth McGrady: to what extent did the modelling and the mitigations disaggregate flow bands, and to what extent at the catchment scale did the modelling and mitigations factor in point source, WWTP and urban discharges? Thank you.
Yeah, so in terms of all the flow splitting, etc., it was all done on an annual time step, and so, for example, some of the mitigations would have been modelled using Overseer, and that being on annual time step would have had some element of flow splitting in it. For example, you might have had a lot of say phosphorus losses going via surface runoff as opposed to deeper, shallow groundwater, shall we say? Not deep, shallow groundwater. Now, did it take into account point sources or wastewater treatment plants? No, it did not. No, but we do have a handle on what the contribution are from those.
Okay, now Roger, a couple of questions for you. There's a question that Kati sort of answered a little bit in the question and answer box from David. What data sharing tools will you provide other than providing data via LAWA? But I also thought it would be interesting to know where your data will be, where your inputted data will be coming from, which stakeholders, and how you're working that out.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, one of the things with LAWA is to try and make the data available. And so, for example, the water quality data that's presented there can be downloaded, so anyone can do their own analysis on it. So that's what we are planning with this as well, although of course recognising the confidentiality concerns that I mentioned earlier, that the data will only be reported at a sub-catchment scale and not at an individual property basis. So that's that would be the plan there. At this stage, where is the data coming from? Really the dairy industry is a bit ahead in terms of collecting this sort of information. So there's a bunch of apps out there that different companies are using to characterise what's going on different properties. So we're linking in with those. And then the other sector that has a good head start is the regional council sector. For instance, Taranaki Regional Council has been monitoring the riparian management efforts that they and the property owners within Taranaki have been putting in. So those are the two sectors where we see data being available now. Other sectors are very keen to be engaged, but I guess to some extent it's a bit of a build it and they will come thing to some, I'm hoping. So yeah, there'll be other sectors that are keen to showcase the good work going on in their sectors, the efforts that are underway, and if they know there's a somewhere for that information to go alongside other sectors, then that will hopefully encourage it.
Cool. They can give you a call or an email after this webinar. It's a question from Madeline Hall. Where are mitigation activities that don't have strong existing evidence behind them fitting in the register? Would there be recommendations to commission further work on these?
There's been a few papers recently just summarising the wide range of actions that are used. There's over 40 actions or strategies out there, at least just dealing with contaminants alone. And then if you add on other things like in river developments and improvements to fish passage and all those sort of things, there's a wide range of stuff. So within the register, we'll try and capture the key ones. But we'll try and make it flexible. We don't, I guess coming back to the last question, we don't anticipate we're going to enable individual landowners to add information into the register, but we imagine that most information will come in via sectors or councils. So.
On a sundry note there, MPI is funding work on new mitigation strategies as part of their contribution, I guess, to the Central Freshwaters package.
Great. There's a few more questions we haven't answered, but we are running out of time. So I just thought maybe we'll just go for one more. Another one from Craig around the confidence for you, Ton. If models have least confidence at the site scale, and it is the site scale that sets resource use limits for landowners, are these methods suitable in a limit setting context?
Well, so obviously this was a broad scale analysis. The techniques could be used to help answer questions in a catchment limit setting process, but it might also be relevant to use different types of assessments and techniques in highly contested situations or where there's significant, a lot of resource significance, whether that be land use or in-stream resources of some description. You might want to utilise a range of methods to try to see whether you get coincident answers, and if not, why not? So we're not suggesting that this type of analysis is used to set limits, say at a catchment scale.
Nor certainly at a property scale. They're just intended to give people an idea of both where the pressure and the likelihood of relieving that pressure are. And that additional tools are available once you get to that final property scale.
Great. Well, I think we'll just go to, there's one more comment or question that just came through that I think you can answer, Rich. That is an anonymous question. Wouldn't we be better off focusing on reducing these negative impacts by transitioning away from animal agriculture and moving towards regenerative plant-based agriculture? One example is hemp having great potential.
Okay, well, I think there's no simple answer here. It's a mosaic of land uses, both on the need to feed people and also to provide people with quality products that return a profit and do so in a sustainable fashion in terms of their environmental footprint. Hemp is probably one of those. I'm not entirely sure in terms of the emissions that come from hemp, but there are obviously many other crops that we could also use. And so stay tuned for the next couple of webinars to kind of find out a bit more.
How I was hoping you would end, Rich. Thank you. Yeah, we've got another webinar at 12 next Monday, which is looking more at the mitigation side of things and how they can be brought into farm plans most effectively. And then the Monday after that is the last webinar in the series, and that's going to be talking about diversity of land uses and, looking at other options and research we're doing around that. So that's time up for today. Thanks everyone for coming along. Thanks for your time. We hope you've enjoyed the webinar. Let me share my final screen with you. That's how you can get in touch with us. And there's the URL there, ourlandandwater.nz/events has got the information about the next couple of webinars where you can register. Right, so today we aimed to show you how to read a new interactive map that shows the extent to which nitrogen exceeds current regulations in New Zealand catchments and how that picture can change when all known on-farm mitigations are applied. We will send you a follow-up email that has a link to the map and some more information about the research. What we're hoping the outtake of the webinar today is that what farmers have been doing is working, and in many catchments accelerating this work will allow water quality expectations to be met. So thanks for sharing your research, Ton and Rich and Roger, and we hope that we'll see everyone at the next webinar next week. So have a great week.